Hello, everybody. My name is Gordon Douglas. I'm an urban planning professor here at San Jose State and the director of the Institute for Metropolitan Studies. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to present another in our series of exciting talks about new books in urban studies, Stacked Decks by Robin Bartram. Robin is an assistant professor in sociology at Tulane University in New Orleans. She did her doctoral work in Chicago. And I'm really excited to be talking about her book today, which we're going to get into in just a moment. I also want to thank my colleague, Chris Hazel, for helping me out with the technology today, and my colleague, Kelly Snyder, and SJSU's Certificate in Real Estate Development for supporting this talk. So by way of a little introduction, I want to say that I think the most exciting social science studies are those that dig into a particular place or a practice or a community and not only tell us many things that we didn't know or hadn't thought of about that particular subject, but through doing so, they build new and powerful and generally relevant social knowledge that help us to understand the bigger structural challenges and concerns as well. And I think that Robin's book is all of this. First, it's about building inspectors. I think it's a totally fascinating subject. Robin makes a point early on in the book that most of us probably never consider, that the building we're sitting in is like safe just thanks to code regulations. And I think that might be the case for many of us, but I'm certainly one of the exceptions, and perhaps many others in the audience are too. From growing up with earthquakes in California to living for 10 years in a creaky walk-up in Brooklyn, I think about building codes and building inspectors all the time. But I still hadn't thought about how much they could tell us about social life and urban inequality. And of course, Robin's research into these individuals and their world is about so much more than who they are and what their day-to-day decisions are about. I think it serves as a window into two different, bigger spheres of interest for both urban planners and social scientists more generally. And those are one, urban inequality, of course, as it says in the title, and two, also bureaucracy. To some extent, it's about the social construction of both of these things, or rather, her book works to deconstruct them and decompose them by highlighting both all the little human actions that take place under and within them, at the same time that it demonstrates just how impersonally stubborn and unmovable the bigger structural conditions are. So one of the most powerful and I think potentially widely applicable contributions of the book here is all of the examples of the moments of choice and discretion that these building inspectors have. And I'm sure Robin is going to give us many of those examples in her presentation. To me, this is as much a contribution to our understanding of interpersonal power dynamics in general as it is of urban inequality. And I made this little list in the margin on page 151 in the book of all the people I could think of with jobs that put them into positions of making or breaking people's days, basically just on their own potential fairly subjective kind of spur of the moment decisions. Not just building inspectors and permit approvers, we might think of cops, of course, but also people like airline gate staff, IRS agents, ticket collectors on trains, bank loan assessors, and even professors, maybe dealing with a student's request for, to turn in work late or get a different grade or something like that, right? Where numerous people who make up these minutia of kind of day-to-day decisions that add up, Robin would argue, to the structures of inequality in social life. In these ways, I think it gives us a pretty interesting sociology of these folks who are the literal faces of what are often assumed to be faceless bureaucracies. Decomposing it down into the individuals, the people whose individual decisions add up to making either a sort of nightmarish Kafkaesque bureaucracy or something maybe less maddening on an individual, everyday sort of basis. The book digs into this incredibly complicated personal and structural conditions that make up urban inequality, and we're going to hear much more about all of that now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here to talk to you about my book. So I'm excited to talk about my book. I am a sociologist. I study housing and inequality, and I'm particularly interested in material conditions and how they impact the affordability or perhaps the unaffordability of housing. And within these general areas, I'm also really concerned with the potential for housing policy to correct generations of injustice along the lines of race, class, and gender as well. So my book, Stacked Decks, brings these interests together. The book shines a light on the work of city building inspectors in Chicago and explains why it is that cities like Chicago and elsewhere still deal with vast disparities in housing conditions, why tenants still live in slum-like conditions, even though the building code was designed well over 100 years ago as a way to curtail slumlordism. It also explains the persistence of dangerous buildings, and how inspectors make decisions about building code violations in each of these contexts. So the book makes two main arguments. First of all, the street-level bureaucrats, like inspectors, can act in unexpected ways, at times by protecting some of the city's most precarious residents, and also by punishing the privileged. The second argument, though, is that aspects of the stacked deck, aspects of urban inequality, really stymie well-intentioned actions. And I'll get back to these points shortly, but first I want to talk a little bit about what building code enforcement actually looks like in Chicago. So the bulk of building code enforcement consists of inspections that are carried out by city building inspectors in response to service requests about all kinds of kind of quality of life, health and safety issues, from landlords not providing heat and smoke detectors, to dangerous porches, mold, unpermitted construction work, crumbling bricks, or also things like flaky paint on windows, bed bugs, rats, cockroaches, all of these things. So most cities have some kind of system in place like this. In Chicago and elsewhere, it's 311. So you can call 311 or you can lodge a request online and a building inspector will eventually respond. Over a 10-year period, inspectors in Chicago recorded over 982,000 311 prompted violations of Chicago's municipal building code. This is a breakdown for some of the most frequent types of violations. So you'll hear about many of these throughout my talk today. But you can see things like windows, exterior walls, missing smoke and carbon monoxide detectors are the most commonly recorded violations. I also want to draw your attention to illegal conversions, the second category down here on this slide. So this refers to basements and sometimes attics that have been converted into living spaces without obtaining correct permits to ensure they're up to code. So commonly the issue here is that they don't have enough points of egress, meaning they don't have enough exits or enough light and ventilation. They've also been making headlines across the country recently because of increased flooding. So because they're below ground level, they're the first unit in any building to flood. And only last year, or 2 years ago now, 11 residents in New York City died in these kinds of basement apartments because of floodwaters from a big storm. So I expect this will become increasingly common in places all across the country with the climate crises. And I think it needs much more attention in terms of research and policy about a response. So buildings can receive multiple violations per inspection. The mean number is 8, but I saw inspectors record 0 violations in some buildings, and I saw them record well over 30 in others. One other important thing to know about inspections is that they can produce a variety of consequences. So most often they result in a notice sent to the property owner in question, but in cases that inspectors deem serious, they send property owners to court to mandate repairs. Inspections can also lead to substantial fines, demolitions, and evictions as well. So clearly the outcomes of inspections matter. But as my research kind of progressed, the first thing that really hit me was the amount of discretion that inspectors have in deciding what to do when their inspections turn up violations, which they invariably do. Because as I very quickly learned during my research, all buildings have violations. So inspectors love to tell me they could find violations even in brand new buildings. And as Inspector Paul told me, apparently also in the White House as well. So all buildings have violations, but not all violations result in a citation or a court case. Not all violations lead to inspectors taking action. Instead, like all frontline workers, from social workers to police officers and everyone in between, inspectors have discretion and often need to categorize complex situations. Heavy caseloads, limited time and resources, and often some pretty complex situations require frontline workers like inspectors to make on-the-spot decisions. In the words of one inspector, inspections are judgment calls. But like many other street-level bureaucrats, inspectors really think through complicated situations. They gather evidence to make a decision about what they think is best in any given situation, within the confines, of course, of what they have the power to do. So considering the fact that all buildings have violations, but inspectors use their discretion to make judgment calls, my mission became finding the answers to two questions. First of all, if all buildings have violations, then what do inspectors consider about people and buildings when deciding what course of action to take? And second, how do these decisions aggregate with respect to existing trends in inequality in the city? So I tried to get at these questions from every angle possible. At first, I worked as an intern at the Department of Buildings in Chicago. This initially involved me spending many months working in a small corner of the office that specializes in escalators and elevators. But eventually this enabled me to get access to interviews and ride-alongs with inspectors as they went out with inspections and made decisions about what counted as building code violations. These ride-alongs covered the whole city, all different kinds of buildings and a whole range of violations. Every day and every inspection was really kind of markedly different. One inspection, I'd be straining my eyes to see evidence of bed bugs. The next, I'd find myself treading carefully on burnt out floorboards in a building that had been partially destroyed by a gas explosion. I also sat in on housing court cases and interviewed judges and attorneys. Throughout the book, I also put my qualitative data in conversation with some quantitative analyses of building violation records, 311 service requests, census data, and housing market data as well. So I had a good amount of data, but I also had some pretty clear expectations going into the research. And what I really expected to find was that inspectors were encoding their racism, their classism in their interpretations of buildings and their decisions about who to cite. So I was expecting to end up telling a story of building inspectors punishing poor residents of color through building inspections. And I expected this for a couple of reasons. So first of all, there is a wealth of research in sociology, social sciences, and beyond, attesting to biased perceptions of disorder, which would predict that inspectors, other street-level bureaucrats, indeed any one of us, would be more likely to see things like disrepair and dilapidation as more problematic in low-income communities of color. Similarly, another group of research would assume that inspectors would engage in broken window style policing, and again, punish poor residents and residents of color. I don't even really think we necessarily need academic research to support these expectations. These theories are sort of backed up in countless accounts of things like police stops and traffic ticketing that regularly reach the media. My expectations stemming from all of this existing literature, I think, seem even more likely considering that most inspectors are white working class men. But this is not quite what I found. So contrary to all of these expectations, I heard inspectors telling me they showed compassion in low-income communities of color. In fact, time and time again, inspectors very explicitly made what I call stabs at justice to punish the privileged, not the poor. In particular, as I'll demonstrate, inspectors organized their work around going easy on homeowners and small-time landlords they perceived to be low or moderate income. In contrast, Inspectors opt to more heavily penalize professional landlords and people they think can afford to maintain buildings but fail to. So really quite the opposite of punishing the poor. And just a note on my terminology here, stabs at justice is a term that I use to capture small-scale attempts to even things out. Importantly, they're not really planned or calculated in the same way as something we might think of as resistance. They stem from normative ideals, but they're much less likely to be geared towards wholesale change. Instead, stabs at justice are efforts to make things fairer in the moment at hand. So in what follows, I'll demonstrate some examples of these stabs at justice and then go on to discuss some implications. So I saw inspectors stabs at justice in action most often during my fieldwork. Point in the talk, I'm demonstrating the first of the book's arguments that frontline workers like inspectors can act in unexpected ways, at times by protecting some of the city's most precarious residents. Like most inspectors, Inspector Malcolm is white. He grew up in a working class neighborhood in Chicago that was home to mostly Polish Americans before most left for the suburbs during white flight. I accompanied him to a building that had been reported to have an illegal basement conversion. This is one of those illegal conversions from the chart I showed before. This building is not the exact same building that we went out to that day, but it is fairly close in many respects. So as we pulled up to the building, we were met by the owner, a Latino man in his 60s who showed us the now empty basement and pointed out that the kitchen that had been in the corner had been removed, meaning he could no longer rent it out as an apartment. But despite this, Malcolm could still insist that the owner get retroactive permits, which would require hiring an architect on top of paying city fees. And indeed, inspectors demand this from property owners all the time. This is kind of by the book's building code enforcement. In this instance, though, Malcolm opted not to force the owner to get permits, nor to write him up with some issues with the basement windows that we'd noticed around the side of the building. As became customary, he explained his decision to me as we got back into his truck. This guy, he told me, in this 2-flat, probably doesn't have a lot of money. Plus, he's just lost the revenue from renting out the basement. I don't want to pile on extra for this guy, telling me that in this neighborhood, a rapidly changing, historically Latinx neighborhood, the owner would be losing between $600 and $700 per month from renting out the basement. So he saw his decision as a step at justice, a way of helping out this small-time landlord who he assumed didn't have much money. But this wasn't all. There was an additional reason for his leniency. So Malcolm told me later that he suspected development companies were responsible for making the initial 3-on-1 call in situations like this, in efforts to drive down property prices or prompt owners to sell so they could snap them up in changing and increasingly lucrative areas. He told me that contrary to an average home buyer who likely wouldn't know what an illegal basement was or not, developers are savvy about what violations are and what counts. So Malcolm had a full plate of inspections that day, but he still spent some time talking to the landlord about how much it would cost to hire an architect, and also offered him some advice about grandfathering a garage into the building code. I point these things out because I want to address an alternative explanation for inspector leniency. I want to be clear that inspectors overlooking issues like Malcolm did for this illegal conversion is not a matter of neglect. It's not that inspectors just don't care what happens. Rather, I argue it's a stab at justice, an effort to, in Malcolm's words, not pile on extra. And I heard this rhetoric a lot, inspectors telling me they didn't want to add to the headaches of struggling property owners. So what I hope is becoming clear is that inspectors' assessments of housing conditions stem from their assumptions about the financial status and the struggle of the building owner in question. And their compassion is especially heightened in situations where they believe profiteers are further stacking the deck. This is really exemplified in the following excerpt from Danny, who, like Malcolm, is a white inspector that grew up in a white ethnic working class neighborhood in Chicago. He's been an inspector for 14 years, and he has a loud, booming voice and a beard. So during an interview, Danny recalled trying to help a woman whose family home was in such a bad state that it was close to being recommended for demolition. He told me the woman was Black, was a single mother, and had been holding down numerous jobs until her car broke down, causing her to lose her jobs and thus the ability to pay her mortgage. What I'm running into is people that are stuck in between, he told me. They're trying to make it in a market sense, but their mortgage got out of control. They're in foreclosure and their principal, interest and taxes are $3,000 a month. And that's just outrageous for a 2-flat in that neighborhood. So Danny's sympathy for this woman was rooted in her financial status and her struggle to make it as a property owner when the odds were stacked against her. And now her home that had been in her family for 2 generations was facing demolition. So luckily, Danny knew enough about the building code and what tips a building over the scale to be put on the city's demolition schedule. He cited the building for its severe issues, but did not recommend it for demolition. So where does this compassion for low-income residents of color come from? Why do these white working-class guys want to make stabs at justice on their behalf, considering all those citations a few slides ago that would suggest very much the opposite? So I think there are a few overlapping answers to this question. First, I argue that their working-class background heightens inspectors' awareness to struggle in the face of adversity. And the way that this manifests in their work is in a kind of solidarity and compassion for the struggling owners of modest single-family homes and small rental buildings that they inspect. This is also, I think, because this is the very residential landscape that many inspectors grew up in. So inspectors like Malcolm and Danny, who we've just heard from, and their parents lived in these kinds of buildings on this slide in neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city when they were majority white. So back then, second-generation European immigrants lived in the small bungalows and owned the small rental buildings, commonly renting out second or third units to extended family members. But since then, due to white flight and the whole other plethora of residential shifts in Chicago and beyond, most of these neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city are majority Black and Latinx. So I've mentioned the south and west sides of Chicago, and this map helps to convey what exactly I mean by this. In fact, what most Chicagoans mean when we use these kinds of phrases. So this might not be news to anyone listening to this talk, but I think it's still important not to ignore the kind of racialized language we all use and point to the way that it has been normalized. So of course, these terms obscure heterogeneity, but this map conveys what building inspectors and most Chicagoans think when they talk about the north, south, and west sides. The important thing to know, for the purposes of this talk at least, is that many of these now Black and Latinx neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city used to be white. So if we look back to these images, the houses of the image on the top of the slide are in a west side neighborhood close to Midway Airport, actually, which is predominantly Latinx today, but was 90% white until the 1990s. The second picture is a small rental building in a neighborhood on the south side, which is predominantly African American, but was once home to mostly German and Irish immigrants. So these are the exact kinds of buildings that signify hard work and struggle to inspectors. So inspectors empathize with buildings, home ownership, and the kind of working class struggle for the American dream that they signify, rather than necessarily with the people who occupy them. I also want to be clear, though, that I don't think inspectors' actions are solely kind of class-based individual dispositions that stem from their residential backgrounds. They're also part of an institutionalized practice in the buildings department. So helping out low-income homeowners and small-time landlords is not official policy. That has become routinized and institutionalized over the years due to things like informal training in the office, as well as interactions between inspectors, particularly when they first get their jobs. But I also don't want to over-romanticize inspectors. They're far from kind of anti-racist progressive heroes. They're not always compassionate towards tenants, and they also tend to overlook the way that whites have profited from the stacked deck. So I call this white blind spots. I'm happy to talk more about the tenants portion of this if that is of interest. But the following excerpt from Steve helps to illuminate what I mean by white blind spots. So Steve is a white inspector in his 60s, also from a Chicago neighborhood. Look, he told me during an interview, on the south and west side of the city, you're always going to find the worst problems. Today, it's pretty much racial. The Black, the Hispanic communities are probably the most devastated. But you go back maybe 50, 100 years, and it was another ethnic group that was in that same situation. You know, I saw my mom on Monday, and where she grew up on the south side, they didn't have any hot water, and that was just the way it was. So here, Steve compares the contemporary south and west sides of the city, which remember are today majority Black and Latinx, to earlier moments in Chicago's racial history. Moments when, before whites left for the suburb, these areas were majority white. So he was telling me he believed that whites of previous generations occupied structural positions similar to people of color today. There is something to Steve's statement. European immigrants in the early 20th century did have limited options for housing. But by making this comparison, Steve is also conveying his white blind spot. The comparison he draws ignores how white Americans, including those who were once European immigrants, have stacked the deck in their favor through policies encompassing housing, taxation, land use, etc. So inspectors make categorical distinctions based on ideas about who the deck is stacked for and against. But these distinctions, like many distinctions in the world, are partial. In short, inspectors seem unaware of the extent to which the deck is stacked in favor of whites. However, whatever the origins of their compassion and the sort of partial distinctions that they make, the surprising and sort of unexpected fact still remains that inspectors do show compassion to property owners in communities of color and attempt to establish justice on their behalf. So as I've told you, I saw this in action during my field work, but it's also backed up by the numbers. I have an article in City and Community that provides some statistical support for these trends over time. And one of the reasons I did this analysis is because I was so surprised by my own qualitative findings. This is just one half of the story. And the other half is that along with their resolve to go easy on low-income homeowners, inspectors frequently spoke of their determination to go after the bad guys. Bad guys for inspectors are usually bad landlords, developers, and people who profit from negligence. Just like their empathy for moderate homes and struggling homeowners, inspectors interpret some buildings as being signs of undeserved profit, greed, and negligence. Again, inspectors interpret the city's residential landscape and use it to decide which property owners and landlords deserve their scrutiny. A building code violation, let's say a leaky ceiling, means something very different to inspectors in a building that looks like this versus this. So the building on the left is new. I think we'd expect rents would be probably above average. I think we'd assume the developer, the owner's landlord, would be making decent profits from the building. The building on the right, on the other hand, is smaller, older. I think we'd assume the rents would be more modest, likely because there isn't things like in-unit laundry, and that's the kitchen fixtures aren't brand new. Probably the landlord here is not making as much profit as the building on the left. So inspectors will be more likely to go easy on the building on the right and come down hard on the building on the left for that same leaky ceiling. So of course, these assessments might not be 100% accurate, but these are the kinds of logics that inspectors use. So let's get back to the second portion of the book's first argument, that street-level bureaucrats can act in unexpected ways, at times by punishing the privileged. So I had joined Inspector Nick at a two-story vacant brick building when we discovered the owner's building permit did not cover the gut rehab that was underway. So this building looks more like that modest rental than the brand new luxury building I showed on the previous slide. But the insufficient permit issue was enough to invoke Nick's contempt anyway. So the rooms were full of construction materials. It actually made it really hard to walk through the building, and 3 workers had just stopped for lunch after literally just finishing drywalling the entire first floor. "You might want to start working at this point," Nick said, kind of quietly to the workers. "The owner's going to have to get a new permit." So a couple of things surprised me about this. I was surprised by Nick's lack of insistence, and I was surprised by his almost whispering tone. I'd seen him get pretty kind of riled up in buildings in the past. But he later explained that he hadn't told them they must stop work, nor had he put an official stop work order on the building, which he could easily have done with just a stroke of the pen, because he wanted to make the owner learn the hard way. So instead of stopping the work, Nick let them work on, knowing that his write-up would insist on the removal of all the drywall in the building just to have an inspector check the electric wiring behind it, and then they'd have to replace the drywall all over again. So this would be costly for the owner and, perhaps just as importantly to Nick, really annoying. But it would also, Nick reasoned, mean the owner would have to keep paying the workers for this extra work, who, he told me, probably have kids to feed. So Nick seemed to kind of relish the power he had to penalize this owner, and I soon learned why. In the car later on, he told me that based on the finish of the building, such as the granite countertops and the chrome appliances, he assumed the owner of the building was planning on flipping the property and would thus be passing the insufficient permit issues on to the next owner. So here then, Nick opted to penalize someone he thought was trying to profit by taking shortcuts, while also trying to protect the workers and the future owner of the building. So I like this example because it shows two different kinds of stabs at justice, going easy, going after in one inspection. It also shows the small material clues that inspectors pick up on to guide their assessments. So we've just seen an inspector make a stab at justice towards someone he thought was a property flipper. But most universally, the bad guys for inspectors are professional landlords and other property owners who don't maintain buildings, even though they're bringing in rental income. So for the last inspection, one afternoon, I accompanied Inspector Eddie to a 6th flat in a high poverty neighborhood. As we walked up to the building, I heard Eddie mutter, "There are some poor people in this place." Before I could respond, a man approached us to tell us that he was the one who made the initial 311 call a few months earlier about a lack of electricity and some cockroaches, and he led us inside his apartment where he lived with his wife. The couple, who were both Black and in their 20s, pointed out numerous violations throughout their whole apartment that the landlord had refused to fix, ranging from holes in the walls and clogged drains to kitchen and bathroom ceilings that were thick with orange mold. The back porch was unstable, the back gate was padlocked, and various kinds of insects were in plain sight on the kitchen walls and floors. The landlord had also failed to provide heat last winter or electricity for the past 3 months. And this was the height of the summer, but because there was no electricity, the couple couldn't use air conditioning units or even fans. The lack of electricity meant they also had been unable to use some medical equipment that they'd had to return at the risk, they told us, of voiding their insurance, as well as exacerbating respiratory issues. And this was just one of the tenants I met during my research whose health issues were linked to or compounded by their living conditions. So the couple were really disgusted with the condition of their apartment and their landlord's negligence. And Inspector Eddie seemed to be too. He had been furiously scribbling notes the whole time we were there, telling them that he was sending the landlord straight to court and wanted to get every detail down. As we were leaving, he asked them what they pay for rent. I ask, he explained, because when I pray for landlords to go to landlord hell, it's based on how much rent they charge for a shithole. He said this after finding out the rent was $7.50 a month. So Eddie's comment came with a decent amount of anger and a little humor kind of directed toward the landlord. And the couple seemed kind of unfazed by the comment, but I do think it's worth considering how this comment might have made them feel, or indeed might make any of us feel, for a city official to use this kind of language to talk about your home. I think this speaks volumes about the way inspectors tend to treat tenants. It also speaks to one of the ironies of code enforcement. So most 311 calls come from tenants, but inspectors don't really show compassion to them in the same way they do struggling property owners. Whatever his feelings toward the tenants, though, as Eddie promised, the write-up for this building lists many violations, 35 in fact, some of which you can see here. And the court case against the owner would likely force her to fix these issues or sell the building. Sure enough, I drove by the building a year or so after Eddie's inspection. There were new windows and a new back porch. What became of the tenants, though, and how the repairs affected the rent they pay is another question. And I'll get to this question shortly. But just to summarize, I've talked so far about the first of the book's arguments, and shown that inspectors try to protect some of the city's most precarious residents and punish some who have more wealth and privilege. So let's now move on to the second argument, the aspect of the housing market stymie well-intentioned actions. So back to the question of what happens to buildings and tenants after inspections. So I did some digging, I sat in on housing court cases and gathered some housing market data, and the following is what I found. So if we first talk about rental buildings, so as I've shown, inspectors come down hard on some properties by listing as many violations as possible and insisting issues get resolved. So if we think back to the landlord of the unit with the orange moldy ceiling, based on my analysis of rental prices and building code violation data, if she fixes those 35 violations, she could be expected to raise the rent from $750, which is what it was when Eddie did his inspection, if you remember, to $926 the following year. If she fixed none, the rent would be $771 based on the average increase for that tract. That's over a $150 increase from what we could otherwise expect, which is a lot in a neighborhood where 3/4 of renters make incomes that put them below the poverty line. A new monthly rent of $926 would eat up almost 70% of that income. I think it's probably hard for many of us to imagine just how little money that leaves tenants for other daily expenses, not to mention the expenses of perhaps finding a new place to live. For a home to be affordable, housing costs are supposed to be no more than 30% of a household's income. So this rent is really unaffordable, wildly unaffordable for this neighborhood. Beyond this one building, fixing violations is associated with rent increases more broadly, either because landlords need to do this to cover costs, or perhaps they use repairs as an excuse to rehab units, for example, then charge higher rents. Overall, higher rents make cities less affordable, and this has disproportionate impact on people with the fewest resources. I think this relationship between rent hikes and inspections also has implications for recent calls for proactive rental inspections in many cities. While the idea is an excellent one in principle, I think we need a lot more research to ensure such a policy doesn't exacerbate the dearth of affordable housing by causing rent increases. So there are also important impacts for owner-occupied buildings. Inspectors make stabs at justice here by not insisting low-income homeowners fix all their violations. I saw this in housing court, where judges and court inspectors allow low-income property owners months and months, sometimes years, to fix issues. Like when a woman agreed, like when an inspector agreed to allow a woman extra time to complete some repairs on her porch. The woman was white, looked to be in her 20s, and hushed her baby in its stroller during the court case. So like many others in building court, the woman's 3-unit building had a porch that desperately needed repairs. Some of the steps had rotted and the handrails were loose. Her father, who had taken care of the building, had died a few years ago, and her mother was housebound. The unit that they had rented out on the 3rd floor was now vacant, meaning they weren't bringing in any rental income. This was her second court date, and she had promised to have made progress on the porch by now. She showed the inspector some photos on her phone of some work that she had completed, including removing some debris and fixing some door glass. But nothing had been done to the porch. The inspector looked at her. "Your family has owned the building for a long time, right?" he asked, and watched as she nodded. Finding out that the family were long-time owners with few resources was really all he seemed to need to know. He agreed to allow her more time to fix the porch. In the meantime, unresolved violations like rotting wood porches deteriorate and become more dangerous. Violations also remain on records for buildings, cloud titles, they can lead to liens and foreclosures, and they're associated with lower property prices, preventing property owners from getting loans and refinancing. So they're bad news overall. And remember, inspectors are more likely to not insist violations get fixed in communities of colour. So in spite of inspectors' compassion towards struggling property owners, housing inequality persists. So what does all this mean? It means, I argue, that the housing market subverts stabs at justice for renters and for homeowners. The for-profit rental market and the lack of rent control means that stabs at justice perpetuate the lack of affordable housing in decent condition for renters. And it means that landlords are able to profit both from repairs as well as disrepair. For owner-occupiers, the lack of resources for home repairs means that stabs at justice can only reinforce the divide between wealthy and poor homeowners, and repairs make otherwise affordable housing unaffordable. In both contexts, housing inequality is reproduced. But I want to point something out, which is that inspectors don't really have many options to make a difference. In the current system, doing the converse of their stabs at justice would not really help either. Demanding low-income property owners make all their repairs promptly is unrealistic and prompts displacement, debt, and further financial struggles. And letting landlords off the hook is not likely to do much to help improve tenants' living conditions either, because it removes the legal imperative to provide safe and decent housing. And inspectors know this. They know they can only do so much. So what does this teach us? What are the takeaways here for sociology and perhaps for policy, housing policy as well? First, I think that to find actually effective policies, we really need to understand the relationship between the implementation of these policies and larger structures in which they operate. For example, housing markets and entrenched racialized poverty. I think without investigating how building code enforcement really works, for example, we assume that it reproduces housing inequality, and I assume it's via certain mechanisms like neglect, broken windows, policing, etc. We've misidentified the mechanism. And I think it's really important to accurately identify mechanisms that reproduce inequality in order to steer and reorient our focus with respect to solutions. So once we accurately identify the mechanisms in the case of building code enforcement, for example, it becomes clear that the answers to improving housing are not tweaks to discretion or implementation necessarily, but rather changes to the broader system of inequality and racialized poverty in which implementation is embedded. So, for example, things like rent control, reparations, the regulation of profit, perhaps community building code enforcement programs, and repair programs. The latter, repair programs, is a topic that I've been investigating for the past year or so. So all buildings age over time and need repairs, and it takes a lot of resources to maintain a building, meaning repairs are always going to disproportionately impact those with fewest resources, and again, make their perhaps otherwise affordable housing unaffordable. This is especially true due to historical and contemporary real estate practices, which have targeted low-income residents of color for mortgages on buildings in disrepair. And this is in many ways where my book ends. What's the point of building code enforcement if people can't afford to comply? But if building owners had access to some kind of program to cover the costs of repairs, I think it's reasonable to suggest there would not be so much disrepair in communities across cities like Chicago. They also think that this could be a way to prevent deadly fires, which so many cities like Chicago are still dealing with. Resources for repairs along with a system of rent control could also go a long way to prevent landlords using repairs as justification for rent hikes. And I should have more to say on both of these topics soon. But to conclude for now, we all know that code enforcement doesn't work as it should. The evidence, I think, surrounds us. But we need to walk in the shoes of building inspectors and other people who are charged with implementing policies to really understand why things don't work and why inequality is so persistent. We need to hear from people like inspectors and other street-level bureaucrats to understand what they're up against. They're the ones, after all, who work within the laws that get passed and implement the policies and programs that get rolled out. I think we all too often work backward and infer on-the-ground decisions of frontline workers from patterns and data sets. maps, statistical models, or sensationalized headlines. And the irony is that we need to listen to individuals on the ground to see that the solutions to contesting inequality and improving people's lives, improving people's housing, don't actually lie at the level of individual decisions. Solutions lie instead in the structures and systems in which individuals operate. Thank you very much for listening.